Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer here to bring you an updated deck tech for October of 2018, featuring Black Green Rock, Golgari Midrange, whatever you prefer to call it, and I'm going to explain my changes, explain why I'm playing what I'm playing, and perhaps give some alternatives if you are considering a list like this but you're not quite sure about certain choices. So, the first thing I would like to point out is that this is not a top to bottom comprehensive deck tech. I am going to be referring to my old top to bottom comprehensive deck tech as the base for the changes I've made here. I will link to the old deck tech in the description below, and if you're looking for an introduction to the archetype or an explanation for some of the cards that I did not change this month, then that is what you would want to check out. The other thing I'd like to mention before we get into the specific choices for October is that this is not the only way to play Black Green Rock. Not at all. I don't know if I made that clear enough in my deck tech. This is a 25 land build without Dark Confidant and with 4 Tireless Tracker. We're leaning really heavily on the tracker to be our primary card advantage engine that also doubles as a late game threat. And that's an effective strategy, it really is, but it's not the only way. A split of 3 in 3 on Dark Confidant and Tracker is viable. A lower curve build that features all 4 Dark Confidant and maybe 1 or 2 Tracker at the top end, or even up to 3, that's viable too. So I just want to make that abundantly clear from the start that we're kind of, for now at least, going down the path of no Confidant, 4 Tracker, and a high land count. If and when that changes, I'll be sure to address that in detail. I just didn't want to sell the archetype short by failing to mention that. So there are some resources out there for the more Dark Confidant heavy builds. They're usually lower curve. You can't really play Tassiger alongside the Confidant, so it closes off a few avenues and opens up a few more. Like I did say in the original deck tech, there are some people who are down on Confidant in the current meta. I'm not really one of them. I still think Dark Confidant is a very strong choice, but I really like the way this particular build plays. So, having said those things, let's get into the changes. So what has changed from my original deck tech to now? Well, the first thing you're probably noticing, yes, I got it. I got my 4 Assassin's Trophies. I got my playset. We're finally with the times. We finally picked up the most hyped card, certainly of the latter half of 2018 in Modern. Probably the most hyped card since Jason Bloodbraid got unbanned. In all honesty, I think even though certain other cards like Teferi, for example, really made a dent in the format, the hype for them was not quite as high out of the gates. It took a little while for certain cards that have become format staples to catch on. Not so for Trophy. This card has been hyped from the get-go, and rightfully so. So we'll talk more about the card in depth, but first I just want to say what I took out for it. So I've added 4 Assassin's Trophy to the main deck. Those are the only changes I've made to the main deck, the only additions. So we've cut 4 cards from it to fit these trophies, and we have lost a Cast Down, an Abrupt Decay, a Maelstrom Pulse, and the one of Grimflayer. Now, the latter, it hurts. It hurts because, he's my namesake. He's a really fun card. He's a really effective card. Honestly, he's still pretty good even when you're not building around him, but I think cutting him makes sense, and I'll get into that when we talk about each of those those cuts in more detail. But first, let's talk about the trophy. So, Assassin's Trophy, like I said, hyped to the skies right out of the gates. An interesting kind of phenomenon has happened, though, as we got closer to the release date, and now that it's been out for, a week or so. I'm thinking people are starting to underrate this card a little bit. So let me briefly explain. There's a couple schools of thought. The first school of thought is that this is an absurdly powerful answer because it catches everything in the format unless it says indestructible, unless it says hexproof. In other words, if as long as those first two words are applicable, destroy and target, Assassin's Trophy is going to take care of it. Now, the downside is real. The downside is definitely significant. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle their library. You will note that that does not say put it onto the battlefield tapped, like, for example, Path to Exile does. This seems to be kind of a trend in newer card design. We saw Field of Ruin with similar templating, where the Field of Ruin, the basic you tutor up off of that, enters untapped. But having this on a spell feels a little new. Feels a little bit like, whoa, we should sit up and pay attention to this. That's a lot more significant of a downside than Path to Exile against certain matchups, and there's no question that it is. So, like I said, the one school of thought is like, this card is through the roof fantastic because it just answers everything, and this is an answers deck, this is what we need. And the other school of thought is starting to hedge a little bit and saying, well, it's good, but is it good enough to justify that downside? I think pretty much everybody agrees that it's playable. And pretty much everybody agrees that you want at least 2 copies in your 75. I think even the most conservative approach to Assassin's Trophy in a Golgari deck will say, yeah, let's include 2 in the 75. I don't think there's anyone out there who would dispute that. So the question becomes, well, do we want 3? Do we want 4? Are they all main decked? And I think we want all 4, and we want them all main decked. So let's address the least controversial part of that first, which I think is the second half of that sentence. This is a catch-all answer. It belongs in the main deck. Now, that doesn't mean it's unplayable in the side as like a 3-1 split if you want to just have yet another catch-all answer in your sideboard to bring in and you don't think that it quite merits the 4th slot in the main deck. Totally fine. But I think on its face, this card is more efficient in the main deck than in the sideboard, all else being equal. Now, as to the number of copies, well, again, this comes back to that kind of bifurcation in the 2 different schools of thought. Some people are starting to say, I think the downside is a little bit too real to want to go all in on 4 of these. And other people are saying, nope, it is strong enough, it is flexible enough that we just want to play 4. Now, of course, time will tell. I'm not claiming that I specifically have the answer here, by no means, but I personally am leaning in the camp that, look, we want all 4. The reasons for that are really context dependent. So there's a little bit of straw manning that goes on with some people who are saying, I don't think people realize just how much of a downside giving the opponent an untapped basic land is. Whereas I would say most dedicated BGX players have carefully considered the downside. It's possible to acknowledge the downside accurately and still think that 4 copies main deck is correct. Those two, holding those 2 beliefs is not mutually exclusive, So I think there's a little bit of straw manning that needs to be pushed back against there. The people who are advocating for 4, the invested players, have considered the downside. We are aware of how significant that downside can be, and we still want to play 4 of them in the main deck. So why is that? Well, this is an answers deck, this is an interactive deck, and this is a deck that historically has suffered from what's called the wrong half of the deck problem. Like, you are on the draw, let's say, and you have a hand of Thoughtseize and Inquisition and Liliana of the Veil and a few lands, maybe like an Abrupt Decay, so you do have an answer, something like that, or maybe you have a threat like a Tarmogoyf, but mostly you're all in on hand disruption. You keep it game one against, an opponent you're not sure what they're on. This is going to be great a lot of the time, but then they're on a hyper fast affinity start. They just dump out their hand and your stuff looks really, really bad. Or you could have, the opposite problem. You could have a hand loaded down with fatal pushes and abrupt decays against blue-white control. And that starts to look a little bit silly. So that's called drawing the wrong half of the deck, and that's especially problematic game one because you have not had a chance to bring out the bad cards and load down on the more playable effects for whatever matchup you're facing. Assassin's Trophy, in my opinion, it cannot be overstated how much this card does to mitigate that wrong half of the deck problem. This card is always alive no matter what your opponent's doing. Now, don't mistake that for saying it's always a good play on turn 2 no matter what they're doing. This is a card that is more ideally played in the latter turns of a match. Now, some will say, well, that means it shouldn't be a 4-of. You only want 2 or 3 because you don't want your opening hand clogged up with them. I understand that argument, but we are playing 4 Fatal Push. We are playing 6 1-mana discard spells. We are playing still a lot of alternative 2-mana interactive plays. We can always run out our threats. We can even play tap lands and kind of sequence poorly in terms of mana on purpose. Like, in other words, there are a lot of things that we can do without wasting our turn that means that we're not backed into a corner. We don't have to play this on turn 2 just because it's a turn 2 play. Our deck can really, really sequence in such a way that this downside of Trophy is mitigated. Now, the other thing to note, going back to the wrong half of the deck problem, not only does this mitigate that, there were certain matchups, for example, Tron, that's probably the most notorious one. Game 1 against Tron, it's not even a wrong half of the deck problem, it's that so many of your cards do nothing in the matchup. Fatal Push does almost nothing, Inquisition of Kozilek does almost nothing, Collective Brutality does almost nothing, the list goes on. So, even against Burn, let's say you're on a Dark Confidant build, you've got 3 Thoughtseizes and 4 Dark Confidants, those cards can sometimes be actively bad against Burn. They're not even the wrong half of the deck. You're on the wrong deck, almost, it feels like at times. Again, Trophy, as a 4-of, because the more copies we play, the more true this becomes, Trophy goes a long, long, long way toward mitigating all of these things. And these are real problems for a deck that lives and dies based on how effective its interaction is. So, that's kind of just a tip of the iceberg of the Assassin's Trophy debate. I'm happy to kind of leave it there for now, but as I said, time will tell. I wouldn't be surprised if 4-of ends up just being correct. I also wouldn't be surprised if we end up, paring it down maybe to 3. I don't really see it going below 3 personally, ever, I shouldn't say ever, but with the current card pool that comprises Modern, I don't really see it going below 3, but hey, I could be wrong. We'll see. So, why did we make those 4 cuts? Why were those 4 cards the ones we chose to cut in favor of Trophy? Just as a reminder, they're Cast Down, Abrupt Decay, Maelstrom Pulse, Grimflayer. So, let's look at Decay and Pulse first, because we still have 1 of each in the main deck. They used to be 2-ofs. Pretty simple there. They are interactive kind of catch-all spells that cost equal or more in terms of mana investment than Assassin's Trophy did. So that's just kind of a like-for-like replacement. Trophy is just kind of an upgrade on those cards in general game 1. Now, I still really like both of those cards, and you will not see, at the moment, many Golgari players continuing to pack both a Pulse and a Decay main deck, while also packing a second Pulse in the side. So that shows you how highly I value those cards. I think they're still great, but I think at least some number of them have had to make way for Assassin's Trophy. It just doesn't make sense to cut too heavily from other card types when we still have a lot of those floating around. So those were pretty free cuts, trimming down to 1 Decay and 1 Pulse. We also lost a Cast Down, which again, that's just same kind of story, you know? Anything that Cast Down could take care of, Assassin's Trophy can take care of, and hey, Trophy can hit Legends too, so that's pretty nice. Again, Cast Down doesn't have the downside. I'm not claiming... You can never claim that Trophy is strictly better than any of these options, because it's not. It's never strictly better. The downside is always there, and for cards like Abrupt Decay, we no longer have access to the can't be countered clause. So, never strictly better, but I think a clear upgrade to Cast Down overall in the form of Assassin's Trophy, purely on the back of its flexibility. Now, the fourth cut is one I'd like to talk about in a little more detail. That was the Grimflayer, and man, it feels bad. I don't have my representative in the 60 anymore. There's no more Grimflayer in the deck piloted by the Grimflayer. Feels bad, man. But you know, life goes on. We've got to we've got to be strong. We've got to move on, right? So, why did we cut the Grimflayer? Well, first let's look at our overall threat count. So I'm going to quote here from Flying Delver, who wrote and maintains the Abzan/BG Rock primer on the MTG Salvation forum. So all credit to him for the following statement, and also in general. The MTG Salvation forums are a great resource, a great place of discussion, a lot of really smart guys and girls poring over the minutia of your favorite deck, whatever it might be. It's probably got a thread. So credit to Delver here, and credit to the other people in the discussion forums. Feel free to check that out for more information on this archetype and others. But Flying Delver in the primer says, and I quote, "Ideally, it is considered best to run about 13 creatures in an Abzan deck. However, sometimes this number varies from 11 to 14. Now, the Abzan and BG Rock decks share a primer, so you can read Abzan as including Golgari as well. So he says, ideally it is considered best to run about 13 creatures. So let's take a look here. After cutting the Flayer, we have 3 copies of Scavenging Ooze. We have 4 copies of Tarmogoyf, that's 7. We have 4 copies of Tireless Tracker, that's 11. 12, 13, would you look at that? We are right in what is broadly accepted as the sweet spot for number of threats. Remember that almost every threat we play, we can ride to victory. We can disrupt so heavily that one threat will either literally end the game on its own, or will get us so far ahead, you know, by clocking for damage, by putting them on the ropes, by getting some kind of recursive advantage. The Tasigur mill effect, the Scavenging Ooze life gain and growth, the tracker clues, etc., etc. We are a deck that can play Protect the Queen. You know, we can deploy one threat, and realistically, a lot of the time it will win the game for us, or put us so far ahead that we're going to win via other means. So, even though 13 is a little bit, it's kind of a small number on the face of it, 13's pretty good. So when we had the Flayer in, we were at 14, we were at the upper bounds of what's considered acceptable, but going down to 13 feels fine. So in terms of the critical mass of threats, we are right there. Just briefly worth noting, we also have the Planeswalkers that, even though they're not creature threats, they are still threats that can put away the game on their own, and we also have a full 5 man lands. We have not changed our land base at all. We're still running 5 man lands. So our threat density is higher than it looks on paper. Anyway, why did we cut the Grimflayer before we cut maybe a Tasigur because he's a legend, maybe a Scavenging Ooze because we they're a little clunky in multiples and we already have 3. Why the Flare? So, Flare is, I think, pretty clearly the least scary threat on his own when you're not building around him. If you're in a Traverse build and you've got the Delirium coming your way consistently, and you're getting a ton of value out of dumping top cards of your deck into the graveyard, then Grimflayer is the card for you. In a deck like this, he's just kind of like part of the second string, part of the types of threats you play when you can realistically include no more of the tier 1 threats. And the other thing, just beyond that more specifically, Grimflayer helped us out a lot with card selection, right? He helped us dig 3 cards deep, set up the draw for our following turn, and filter away the answers. You understand, it's mostly the answers that we were filtering away with Grimflayer and looking for better answers. Again, a lot of the time, any threat will do, but we need the correct interaction to win the game. And we can stick any threat and be pretty well off. So, again, Assassin's Trophy improving our likelihood of having the right answer at the right time means that the utility that Grimflayer brought to the table is less necessary than it used to be. So between the fact that he's just kind of outclassed by the other threats in general, and then the fact that specifically in playing 4 Trophy makes his card selection aspect a little less needed, I think he was, sadly, the pretty clear choice to cut. It also let us settle in at that magic number of 13. Now, that's not something that you should always aim to do no matter what. Like, in my opinion, build your deck and then check that number and then see if it lines up. And don't just dogmatically follow it, Ask yourself, well, are there good reasons I'm above or below that number? And maybe there are. That's fantastic. You shouldn't just say, oh, I must only play 13 creatures, no more, no less. Having said that, it does feel pretty good while we're testing 4 of a new card, and while the format might be shifting subtly to accommodate it, it feels good to be at kind of the stock 13 threat count, So those are the changes to the main deck, and I'm feeling really good about them. We've still got a ton of interaction. We've still got a nice balance of threats. We've still got the nice spread of 3-in-1 on the two types of Liliana. We've still got all of our utility in the land base. All that's still true. The deck was already good. Let's understand this. The deck was already very, very viable before Assassin's Trophy. I'm quite excited to see how well it can do in the meta now that we have this spectacularly powerful catch-all piece of removal. So, let's move over to the sideboard. I made a couple changes here as well for this month of October, and we'll see how they treat me. So I made 2 changes. First and foremost, I cut a Nile Spellbomb. We're down to 2. 3 Spellbomb was a little high to begin with. I think it's perfectly viable. I think Spellbomb, if anything, is a little underrated in this deck. It's really good, but cutting down to 2 feels a little more correct to me. 3, even though I couldn't find a good argument against playing 3, it still felt a little excessive. That said, I will be happy to go back to 3 Spellbomb in a heartbeat if the meta calls for it. It has never done anything but impress me. So we cut a Spellbomb. We also cut a Flaying Tendrils. That was our -2/-2 3-mana sweeper that exiles the things that would otherwise die from it. So, we just have a lot of sweeper effects already. We just have a lot. We had a lot, and we still have a lot even after cutting that. That's basically all there is to it. You could make an argument for cutting Engineered Explosives over it, and maybe I'll try to cut the EE in the future and bring back the Tendrils at some point. Even Golgari Charm can be primarily considered a sweeper. That's probably the most likely use case across the open meta. So Tendrils, like the third Spellbomb, is not permanently down and out, nothing like that. I just wanted to trim back on some sweeper effects for the moment, and again, I do have a ton of them still, so we're quite fine in that department. We brought in a Maelstrom Pulse from in one of those slots. That is formerly the second one that was the main deck, now it's in the side. I think this card is still strong enough where I want 2 in the 75 until further notice. Definitely a huge fan of being able to bring this in as a general value answer in a lot of matchups. So there are a lot of matchups where your 1 mana discard feels a little subpar, or your fatal pushes feel a little subpar, or maybe your collective brutalities feel a little subpar. There are going to be matches where you're trading out an answer for an answer. You know, you have a lot of answers that are a little meh, but you still want the same amount of answers. You still want the critical mass of answers. Maelstrom Pulse is kind of a good way to round out your numbers in a lot of matchups. And it's just still an all-star against token decks. Still really good against tribal decks. Still gives us yet another piece, in addition to cards like Assassin's Trophy that can hit non-creature permanents. Like, you can really never have access to too many of these effects. So that's why I decided to keep the second Maelstrom Pulse in the 75. The other one is a brand new addition to the sideboard. That is Duress. Now, Duress is a card that, feels a little out of place next to some of these complete bombs like the mythic rare planeswalkers and creatures that have so many abilities they might as well be planeswalkers, to the really powerful and highly sought after effects like surgical extraction and engineered explosives. Duress is just kind of a common that's been printed a billion times, and what's it doing here? Well, just like you want a critical mass of catch-all answers, sometimes you want to be able to board into a critical mass of discard effects. Now, you could play a 4th Collective Brutality, and I think that's actually very viable. Having access to 4 Brutality against Burn feels great, against Collected Company decks feels great, and it does function in the Duress role as yet another piece of discard. Now, that instant or sorcery only clause, though, sometimes that has me a little bit leery of even boarding in the 3rd. It really depends on the matchup. Whereas anytime you basically want more discard spells, you're not really against an aggro deck, right? You're not against a creature deck that vomits out their hand. So Duress is going to hit just about everything in any of those decks. So you can kind of consider this, for all intents and purposes, a 4th copy of Thoughtseize, but it's painless. And the fact that it's painless is why we play it over the literal 4th copy of Thoughtseize, which is also a viable inclusion in the sideboard. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't say no to that either. But I think Duress, again, just like we want the critical mass of certain effects, we want to avoid the critical mass of you lose 2 life effects. So Duress is just a little bit cleaner in terms of where it fits into the 75 as a whole, compared to the 4th Thoughtseize, and even perhaps compared to the 4th Brutality. This card is great. It's great. It's just yet another 1 mana spell that's super, super flexible. It's in the matches you'll bring it in, it's usually just straight up better than either Inquisition or Thoughtseize. It's that good. That said, there are plenty of matchups where it's dead. So that's why it's in the sideboard, and that's why we only play 1. I could see 2. 2 isn't wrong, but I really, really like this as a 1-of for now. So we have balanced out our deck a little bit more since the original deck tech was created. We have pared down on the sweeper effects just a tad, and the grave hate just a tad, and we've beefed up our hand interaction a little bit, and we've beefed up our flexibility out of the sideboard a little bit. This sideboard, I expect, will continue to change over the coming months. I could see this Fulminator Mage being cut altogether, or I could see trying to go back up to multiple copies of the Fulminator. I don't know. This is one I'm on the fence about. We'll see how the meta shakes out. We'll see how it continues to play. A card like Obstinate Baloth is slightly narrow in terms of when it's really good. It's fine in a lot of matchups, but the matchups where it's a big bomb are relatively narrow. Again, on the fence about cards like this. I'm on the fence about Engineered Explosives as well. Like I said in the original deck tech, a lot of people won't really touch this card if they're only playing a 2-color deck. Maybe that's just correct. Maybe I shouldn't have that in here, but time will tell. I think all of these cards are worth continuing to play with. I think our sideboard looks more balanced than it did last month. And I think our main deck looks a little bit more balanced. We're down to 13 threats instead of 14, therefore we have another piece of interaction. I think that's a little bit more balanced than it used to be. And we have the 4 of Assassins trophy going to, in my opinion, just about fulfill the hype. Now, there are some people who said that this is going to warp the format, because it's replacing Abrupt Decay to some degree. People were saying that permanents that cost 4 mana or up are not going to be playable anymore. Everybody's going to play 4 Assassin's Trophy. The people are going to splash for it. BGX is going to be undisputed tier 1. That's not hype. That's hyperbole. So when I say it's going to live up to the hype, I mean the rational hype, the reasonable hype of, yes, this is a staple 3 to 4 of in just about any deck that can play it without radically going out of its way to include it. Kind of like Fatal Push. I see them as roughly similar power level overall, and I expect them to have a roughly similar impact on the format. That is, they will not warp the format, but they will give rise to minor innovations, like, for example, how these Delve threats took off in popularity to some degree, at least, because they dodged Fatal Push. Assassin's Trophy will exert, in my prediction, a similar influence on the meta, while living up to the hype. Fatal Push, in my opinion, lived up to the hype. Assassin's Trophy will live up to the hype as well. So, I am more than willing to be proven wrong. We will see as time unfurls, but for now, that's my 75 for the month of October. Stay tuned to the channel for, hopefully, several, if not a dozen or more, matches coming up in the relatively near future featuring this exact 75. I'm going to do my best on this channel to not make any tweaks to my deck on any shorter of a time frame than once per month, because I want to give every new innovation a real chance, and I want to show all of you out there how these configurations end up playing. And that's how we find the optimal 75. And this is kind of the eternal Sisyphean task, right? You're never gonna, even if you do find the ideal 75, the meta changes, new printings come out all the time. A brewer's work is never done, or even a list tweaker's work is never done. But hey, that's why we love this game, right? So, for the month of October, stay tuned for more videos. We're going to see how the 4 of Assassin's Trophy does, and we're going to see how the other changes do. Thank you all, as always, so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you're enjoying the content. Feel free, if you're so inclined, give me the like, give me the subscribe especially. That helps me grow the channel, and that in turn gives me more freedom and more incentive to put out more content. So, thank you all, yet again. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you next time.